Welcome to Stanford Legal, where we look at the cases, questions, conflicts, and legal stories that affect us all every day. I'm Pam Karlan, along with Joe Bankman.
Hi, Pam.
Hi, Joe. I was recently reading a poll that was done by the Pew Research Center that I was kind of staggered by what I found out. And it was a poll that asked people, do you support the government preventing people from saying things that are offensive about minority groups? So it was a poll about whether the government could censor speech. And what was stunning to me is that the millennial generation, people ages 18 to 34, were almost 4 times as likely as older Americans, people over the age of 70, to support government censorship. And, of course, the kind of idea you have in your head is young people are always telling truth to power and old people are always shutting them down. And, of course, this sort of suggests that the two groups have very different views about censorship and the government's role in the First Amendment. And who better to discuss these issues with than our colleague Michael McConnell? Michael is a professor of law at Stanford Law School. He's the director of the Constitutional Law Center. He used to be a federal Court of Appeals judge on the 10th Circuit, and he is one of the most knowledgeable people about the First Amendment, free speech, freedom of religion, and the like in the entire country. And as you're going to find out, he's just delightful to talk to.
Well, welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you. With that kind of an introduction, I'm a little scared to be here.
Michael, Pam kind of organized this as people of our generation and older valuing kind of nonconformity and saying something shocking and maybe hurtful. In a younger generation, not so. Let's move it to the campus now. And can you give us some background? What's the law about speech on campus?
Well, the First Amendment applies to public university campuses the same way it applies to the rest of the world. Now, that doesn't mean absolute free speech, though. Some people think, if First Amendment applies, that means it's the Wild West for what you can say. Actually, the free speech clause everywhere, not just on college campuses, but everywhere, is sensitive to context. So, for example, a classroom is not a forum for freedom of expression. If you're in chemistry class, it doesn't mean you can start talking about your favorite rappers. It is true that certain principles of free speech apply even in the classroom, but they're limited. They're out on the streets of the campus, on the other hand, it's going to be much more like a city street. The dorms are going to be treated in a particular way, but public universities are government units just like the city police department.
And there's this weird thing in California, because as you were pointing out, it's the government that usually can't censor you. So generally, if you're a private individual, you're free to use your property the way you want and say, I don't want people to come into my backyard and play a concert. I don't want people to come onto my front steps and talk to me about their favorite issues or the like. In California, there's a kind of different rule for universities than for almost any other private actor, isn't there?
That's right. And California is the only state that has such a law. It's called the Leonard Law. It was passed in, I believe, 1972, and it provides that colleges and universities, whether private or public, are subject to the same First Amendment rules with respect to rules that, when enforced, would result in the discipline of students.
Yeah, so it's a kind of interesting rule, right? It gives students on a campus First Amendment protections. It doesn't give faculty on those campuses First Amendment protections. It doesn't give people who come onto the campus, I often walk across our campus and there are these sort of strange people speaking in the middle of White Plaza, and they don't have the kind of First Amendment rights students have, right?
That's right. And indeed, students don't have, at least under the Leonard Law at a private university, their free speech rights only pertain to disciplinary actions. There are all kinds of things. In fact, what I would say is that some of the more important free speech issues on most campuses are not about disciplinary procedures, but about other things that universities do.
So at a university, is there an especial value to free speech, or is it just the same as everywhere else? I mean, how do you think about free speech on campus?
So this isn't a legal question. This is a cultural or pedagogical question, but we're all professors, and so we care about this. For universities like Stanford or a public university, I think we do believe that the university has a special obligation to foster, not just to tolerate, but to foster freedom of speech and an exchange of ideas. That's not so of every private university. We do have and should have, and I'm glad we have, religious colleges, for example, that have a special mission, and their posture toward freedom of speech is necessarily going to be different. But large public universities and sort of general purpose universities like Stanford are not partisan institutions, not religious institutions. They should be, and usually are, open to a variety of points of view.
So let's jump into one of the controversies on universities like Stanford's. Free speech in the context of a Stanford no longer has the aspect that it did maybe in our youth of liberal students protesting or a liberal speaker protesting. Often the free speech comes up because there's a outside conservative speaker and maybe even a far-right speaker that someone's invited. And the opposition here comes from kind of a liberal majority or a liberal minority.
It's really quite a turnaround from the good old days when when we were young, right? Because back then it tended to be, students expressing themselves often quite offensively, right? Being shut down by the universities, and that led to the conflict. Today, the conflict is much more likely to be students representing a fairly large majority on campus who then go to the administration to ask them to shut down minority voices. By minority here, I mean typically religious or political minorities, and oftentimes I think quite comically. So there was a huge kerfluffle at Yale over the university sending out a message as to what Halloween costumes were appropriate for students to wear. And when some professors there said, we think students should feel free to, they should decide for themselves what Halloween costumes are appropriate, they then get mobbed and shouted at and accused of being racists and ended up leaving the university. Well, I don't know about you, Joe, but I think when I was in college, if the college administrators had told us what Halloween costumes we should wear, we'd have gone nuts, and everybody would have been wearing the most offensive Halloween costumes to the university we could possibly have done, because I think there was a spirit of rebellion in those days. One of the weird things about the free speech controversies today is that they're not animated by a spirit of rebellion. They're animated by a spirit of conformity and the desire to stamp out people with dissenting voices.
Well, but, I just want to press you a little bit on this, Michael, because the letter, as I understood it, the original letter at Yale just said, when you're thinking about what you're going to dress as for Halloween, think about how your classmates might feel about stuff, which doesn't strike me as a terrible thing to say, because it doesn't strike me as a terrible thing to do, to think, should I dress up in blackface for Halloween? I understand that maybe the university shouldn't punish you if you do, but part of what we're trying to do is educate people as members of a society where there are people of very different views, and the question, do you want to use a lot of your time to be deliberately offensive to your classmates, does seem like something worth talking about.
So I don't think the scandal there was the original message, which, as you say, may have been perfectly legitimate. It's that when professors there raise questions about it, they then get mobbed I've seen them film clips of it in a terrible way and essentially driven off campus. That's, I think, the scandal.
I want to bring up a Stanford incident that came up, which is a little bit different. I think maybe even more typical. One student organization invites a speaker, And the speaker has, in his past, made statements that could easily be read as offensive to Muslims. I mean, I read some of those statements. I would say those statements, at least in the context I read them, seem somewhat offensive. How do we think about this kind of a situation? How do we balance here? Do we balance at all, or do we say that's okay?
So I think we just say that's okay. The better thing to do, if you think that a speaker is offensive, is stay away and don't give him a lot of publicity. I don't believe that this speaker would have attracted very much of an audience. I think the whole point of this speaker was to try to, of the people inviting the speaker, was to try to create a commotion, and they got exactly what they wanted. Free speech is actually valuable for more than one reason. One reason is so speakers can get out their point of view, but another reason is it's actually a very calming device for a free society. If all of us know that we are free to speak, then there's no temptation to come out in force and try to shut other people down. I think it's a more peaceful as well as a freer way to run a university or a society.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with our colleague Michael McConnell about free speech on campus. And I want to pick up on something you just said, Michael, about staying away as a very effective way of dealing with things, which is if you compare the recent episode Joe was talking about to an episode that happened a couple of years back where the Westboro Baptist Church, which is not really a church exactly, and certainly not Baptist, came to campus. These are the people who go to demonstrate at military funerals saying that the reason why U.S. service members have been killed is God hates the United States because the United States has, among other things, recognized same-sex marriage. And the university sent around a note to people saying, we're letting them come on campus, but we urge everybody to simply stay away. And nobody showed up. And they were here, they did their demonstration for a half hour, and then they had to leave. And I think you're right, Michael, that was a much more effective way, perhaps, of dealing with the issue. That is, nobody has taken away from that anything about Westboro Baptist coming to Stanford and outraging people.
In fact, I didn't even know they came.
Surprise.
And isn't that good?
Yes, surprise.
I think we had another case where someone came on campus and a group deliberately attended and then made a show of walking out. And I guess that raises a question, to what extent is that simply another exercise of free speech? To what extent is that getting into heckling or preventing free speech? How do we draw the line there?
This is really difficult, and I think it's the most important question in practice. And again, this is not strictly speaking a legal question. This is as much a pedagogical question as anything else. How does a university deal with situations in which you have controversial speech on one side and people who want to protest it on the other? Because protesting controversial speech is just as much protected free speech as the other. But there is a line, and the line I can describe, but it's very hard to apply. And the line is that the counter-protesters should not be allowed to do things that effectively shut down the original speech. They can protest it, but they don't have a right to prevent it. So the easy example of this is, tearing down posters is not a legitimate form of counter speech. Shouting a speaker down is not a legitimate form of counter speech. The example you mentioned, I think, is an interest. The facts here might matter because some say, and I really don't know exactly what happened, but some say this was an event which was ticketed. That is, only a certain number of seats were available and students had to get tickets in advance, and that there was an organized movement by opponents of the speaker to get tickets to go and then to leave. But what that then meant is that there were a number of other people who would have liked to have heard the speaker who were not able to come.
But of course, if they had simply gone and sat there with earplugs in, it would have had exactly the same effect, right?
That's right.
So it's just people who are not going to pay attention are depriving you of an audience of people who might. But
well, yes, I think that's the same case.
Yeah.
It's less dramatic, but I would analyze it the same way.
This is Stanford Legal, and today we're talking with Michael McConnell, our colleague at Stanford, about free speech on campus.
Michael, I want to bring up a related point, and this has to deal more with social conformity than free speech, but I want your thoughts on it, and I want you to tell me if I'm right in that statement. I'm a psychologist, and there are all these famous experiments that show that we are social animals, and in one of the experiments, for example, someone is filling out a form, and there's some smoke coming in. And if they're alone, they see smoke and they leave. And then if they're placed with Confederates who stay in their seats when smoke comes in, they stay too. They don't even save themselves if nobody else is saving themselves. So the application here is political views. And if you're in a conservative environment, we know that social conformity, which is what psychologists label this behavior, tends to silence non-conservative views. And if you're in a liberal environment, the same thing happens. And I wonder if we see this, because we operate generally in a liberal environment, not exclusively. Do we see this in our classroom where conservative views, even for liberal students that might have a conservative view on a matter, are getting silenced? And how do we put that in the context of free speech? Or does it happen?
Well, I think it certainly happens. I think very few conservative students on campus would have the slightest doubt about it. I don't think we can do anything about just the sheer weight of numbers. This is the way it is. But as universities, we intervene in this process. But we intervene selectively, and I think universities need to become more self-conscious and thoughtful about the ideological, the political side of this, because when minority students, racial minority, sexual minority, alienage minority students are treated disrespectfully by their fellow students, we are, I think all responsible professors are very attentive to that, and we intervene. It's not always easy, and sometimes we do it clumsily and poorly, but we see it as our job as professors to make sure that the classroom is an inclusive place for people of all of those dimensions, but not so much when it comes to the expression of conservative views. Those students are on their own, and I think in many classrooms, conservative students have concluded that they should just keep their heads down and their mouths shut because they suffer such social attack, and with no support from the university. So what I think is one of the things that Stanford and other universities should do is to make professors more aware of the problem, and maybe just bring it to the level of consciousness and put it on their agenda for something that responsible professors ought to be concerned about.
We'll be back with more from our guest, Michael McConnell, about free speech on campus next on Stanford Legal on Sirius XM Insight 121.